Hello. Yes, hello, we're live. All right, good to be with you. Welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. My name is Brandon Tessers. I am a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for so very, very, very many reasons. This is just an open conversation. This is time that I am available, make myself available to be here and talk with anyone who shows up about anything that they want to talk about. We pick a topic every week for the stream, and we have one for this week. And I'll say for a few months now, I've been joined every week by Marie Moran, who is, I don't think, going to be able to make it today. I'll keep my fingers crossed that maybe she'll be able to pop in later on, but it might be just me, which means that I will also be kind of looking at the questions that we've solicited around the topic. The topic for today is intergenerational trauma. Interesting. I like that topic. So Margaret Schaus, one of our staff, I guess I should say, I run a small practice called Effective Artistry. We have therapists. We do individual, couples, family, group therapy. We also have executive functioning coaches who do coaching. For therapy, we only work with people in the state of Illinois. That's where we're located, in Northbrook, Illinois. And coaching, our coaches both live around the world and work with people from around the world. It's all done online. Margaret Schaus, one of our therapists, staff therapists here, runs an account on TikTok, which is a social media platform that I have not dared to interact with yet. I think I'm hitting that time in my life where I'm getting stodgy and not wanting to learn the new ones because I like the ones I have just fine. And Twitter is where I mostly engage, although I haven't been there for a few months. But Margaret runs our TikTok account, Effective Artistry, and Margaret and Marie, who runs our Effective Artistry Twitter account, they kind of solicit questions, put topic ideas out there to people who follow us on those social media platforms to kind of see what's on people's minds, what's coming up for people. You know, we try and be as timely as possible and solicit real questions from people and what they're wanting to know about. Of course, some of it is questions that come from us or people we know or just things that we're hearing people talk about. But I'll say that anybody who is here in the chat, especially today, if it's just going to be me on stream, we go wherever you want to go. We pick a topic so that there's something for us to be talking about instead of just sitting here kind of quietly waiting for anybody to put something in chat. I don't want there to be that pressure on you guys, and I don't do well with just sitting quietly and waiting in any context. So we have a topic, but we'll go wherever. We don't need to stay on topic, on that topic. Well, we don't need to stay. It's hard for me to stay on any kind of topic, but we'll go where it seems relevant. So for those of you who are here, just know anything you say, anything you ask, sure, questions and answers is definitely one common way of doing this. But really anything you say, if you're paying attention to me and I'm paying attention to you, then whatever I do or say is going to impact what you do or say next. Oh, Marie's joining. Awesome. And if I'm paying attention to you, which I will be, Marie, I'm live, just kind of talking through the chat. Can I add you to the stream? Are you ready for that? Hello. Okay. So I'll just finish up the show. I was doing that, and then we'll get going. We'll go wherever you want to go, those of you in chat. If you have any questions about working with anyone at Effective Artistry, you can check out our website. And of course, if you're watching this through Twitch, Facebook, YouTube, we have channels and contact information on all those. Please know that if you make comments in the chat, it'll be connected to the account that you're using to be here. So if you're on Facebook, it'll be your Facebook account listed as having said it. So just be aware of that in terms of if you're saying anything that you might not want to be able to be connected to publicly. I think that's pretty much it. My default next statement is, did I cover it all, Marie? But you wouldn't know. I think we covered it all. It's good to see you. How are you?
No. I'm fine, thank you. I'm sorry I'm late. I downloaded some cool new software to my computer a couple of days ago, and it has caused everything on my computer to slow right down. So I was frantically trying to get logged in and couldn't. So sorry everybody for being late, and I'm glad to be here.
Same thing happened to me last
How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. It's Monday, you know, back to work. Yeah, I'm doing well. I'm excited to be here and talk with you about. I looked up the topic. I wasn't sure if you were going to be able to join. So intergenerational trauma. That's fun. Well, fun to talk
Yeah,
about.
it's a big one, isn't it? I've noticed on Instagram recently, well, the algorithm probably has something to do with it, but I clicked on a video that talked about trauma and intergenerational trauma, and now my feed is just full of reels and stories about intergenerational trauma. So it seems to be kind of a hot topic at the moment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are definitely multiple reasons for that, but it's a fun one to talk about.
Yeah. And I guess we always come back to language and how we use terms and phrases differently. So I thought it might be a good one to talk about today as well. To get your take on what intergenerational trauma is and how it shows up for people and who might be susceptible to it. So I guess that's the first question. How would you define intergenerational trauma?
Well, we can start with a simple one, which is intergenerational trauma is trauma that impacts people down the line. So a person experiences some trauma and is changed in some way. And those changes then change or at least impact the way in which that person impacts the next generation. And so that second generation, even though they didn't directly themselves experience the initial trauma, they still have things going on in their lives that we theoretically can trace back to that initial trauma. That's what we mean when we say intergenerational trauma. The big question, of course, is what is trauma? Because that's the one we're going to have to define.
Yeah.
That's a lot more complicated. And I'll say trauma, every week I say language means what it means, right? People use words to mean whatever they mean them to mean, and that's all valid. There's no such thing as correct or incorrect definitions. So trauma is one of those words that gets used by a lot of different people to mean a lot of different things. And I want to make sure that we clarify, because it is a topic where if you're not being clear about what you mean by trauma, you can unintentionally harm people by giving them the wrong impression of what it is that you're trying to say. There's a reason there's a lot of arguing when it comes to trauma, with people saying what they've experienced as trauma and other people saying that it's not. So first off, we'll say sometimes there's like this colloquial way of talking about it where people will refer to capital T trauma versus like lowercase t trauma. Generally, what people mean by that is there are certain things that might happen to a person that we can reasonably assume that most people will agree would label that as a traumatic incident, right? Okay. Like a near-death experience, or being robbed at gunpoint, or whatever, the loss of a loved one, like seeing someone die in front of you, right? These are things that most people, we can make a reasonable assumption that most people would agree, yes, that sounds traumatic. Which really means that it's stuff that we can more or less consider would be universally, or more, almost universally traumatic, meaning that no matter who it happened to, we would call it traumatic. But trauma itself has a more broad concept. So there's a term we're going to use a lot today, talking about intergenerational trauma, especially, called epigenetics. You familiar with that term, Marie?
Yes, but I'm no expert on it, but yes.
Yeah. That, again, language, it means what it means. Like, as a brief aside, I think one of the things that gets in the way of people having good and useful conversations is people being so concerned that maybe they're not using the word correctly, or they don't know as much as they should know about something before being able to speak about it. But you have some information about it. You have some reason that you could use the word. And so you're blocking yourself off from accessing and utilizing that information because you feel like it's partial, not making a comment on what you're saying, Marie, just an example. So epigenetics just means this. Your genetics are in your DNA. That's what we're talking about, the genes in your DNA. It's like a plan, like a blueprint, right? I think that's kind of the general metaphor that's used. Your DNA is a blueprint. the cells in your body, as you're developing and as you're going through your life, they operate in accordance with what is written into the DNA, and everybody's DNA is different. So that's your genetics. Epigenetics refers to the way in which your genetics and your environment interact with each other and impact each other. And the piece that is important to say here, even though I'll make a comment about this later, I guess, excuse me, is that your DNA changes over the course of your life in response to things that happen over the course of your life, meaning in response to things you experience in your environment, your DNA changes. And then if and when you reproduce, the child gets half of their DNA from you, half of their DNA from the other parent, and kind of mixes from there. So any changes to your DNA, which occur over the course of your lifetime, are also then passed along to the next generation. I'm saying all this because a big part of why people tend to focus on trauma is it's a way to kind of talk about something that has an emotional or psychological impact in a way that makes it sound very medical and organic, which is useful to be able to do, but there's, as with everything, upsides and downsides. Meaning that, what do I want to say here? Anything you experience, anything, call it trauma or not, things that you enjoy, impact you as an organism, as a physical, living thing. Some of those impacts are momentary, transient, right? Like you hear a sound, well, what that really means is there's a physical wave passing through the air, the sound wave that strikes your eardrum. And in response to that, then the system of your ear, the physical apparatus, and then the auditory nerve translates that into electrical signals. So your body is creating electrical signals in the nervous system in response to the physical stimuli of a sound wave. So everything that you experience in your environment, all sense data, it creates some physical change on some level in you. Some of those things have larger impact than others. Some of them not even necessarily permanent, but permanent until something else changes, right?
Yeah.
It's just part of development. This is like necessary. How we grow and change and learn is our brain gets rewired. Literally, when you're sleeping at night and we talk about processing, or encoding is the more technically accurate term, encoding things into long-term memory, that means that the physical structure of your brain is changing. So anything you remember from, some of the things you remember from yesterday are physically encoded into your brain, but anything you remember from, 3 months ago or more, we can pretty confidently say exists in the physical structure of your brain in some way. Trauma is a word that we use to refer to certain experiences which impact your physical structure, your biological, organic structure, in such a way that it results in a particular set of things. Mostly what we're talking about there is that you respond to things which are not threats in the future as though they are threats, or that you respond to things which are threats as though they are larger threats than they in actuality are. One way of talking about that too is to think that your body, this is a lot of famous book in this field that really kind of kicked off the wave of trauma-informed fill in the blank, anything that's a trauma-informed therapy or trauma-informed practice, whatever. Mm-hmm. It's called The Body Keeps the Score by Bernard Van Der Kolk. Apparently not a great guy, which is interesting. I don't know. Maybe it's allegations. I don't know. I don't know all the details, but think of it like this. If I'm doing something, I am jumping on the trampoline, and I don't perceive it as a threat, or I don't perceive it as a big enough of a threat that I adjust my behavior towards it, my interaction with it, in order to prevent some harmful outcome. So I'm jumping on the trampoline. I think it's fine and dandy. I'm having a great old time. And then something happens, and I wasn't paying attention enough, or I wasn't vigilant enough, didn't predict, whatever. And I fall and I break my arm. Part of what the body will learn from that, in terms of the body holds the score, their body keeps the score, is, okay, we improperly assessed the level of threat that this was, the level of care and attentiveness that we needed to navigate this thing, or how important it was to avoid this thing, or whatever. And what can happen from that is that then in the future, anytime I come close to getting on a trampoline, my body's going to respond as though I'm about to break my arm. And so even though psychologically, consciously, I can say to myself, like, it's just a trampoline, there's nothing to worry about here, well, my body's still acting like it's a thing that's going to break my arm. And that disconnect between my conscious awareness of what it is I'm about to do, but the fact that my body's responding in fight or flight, can cause a lot of distress, because I don't always know, right? Like, I might not know that it's trauma. For example, same scenario, but one thing that my body could come away with, instead of, oh, jumping on the trampoline is dangerous. Well, if it happened at about sunset, then my body may encode that I got to be real careful around sunset. Mm-hmm. And afterwards, every time it's sunset and I'm outdoors, I start getting panicky. And I might not consciously connect that to, oh, that time I broke my arm jumping on a trampoline. So when we're talking about trauma, there's no like correct or incorrect definition of what makes something traumatic. It's just, you've had an experience that hurt you in some way, and that your body is now encoding in the brain as part of the body. That now encoded into the brain and the rest of the body is a response to some element of that thing, some element of that experience, and is responding to those elements as though it is as dangerous as it was that time.
Right. And it's not necessarily a physical trauma, right? It could be an emotional or... Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, at the root of it, emotional, like emotion and psychology, it's all physical.
Yeah.
At the end of the day. Like whatever consciousness is, and certainly people, you can make arguments about spirits and souls and whatever it is, we can reasonably confidently say that it exists on top of a physical structure of a body. Because, no matter what your spirit or soul or whatever is, if you drink a bunch of alcohol, the way in which your consciousness functions changes in response to something purely physical happening, right? The technical term for this in philosophy is supervene, that if A supervenes on B, that means that any change in A necessitates that there was also a change in B. So no matter what you're thinking, feeling, emotion, psychology, cognition, no matter what's happening in your consciousness, we could map that theoretically against a certain physiological state. Okay. And if your conscious state was any different in any way, then the physiological state would also be different in some way. So it is all, emotion is threat assessment, right? It's at the root of it all. It's about protecting yourself, whether you want to go with like the Freudian avoiding pain and pursuing pleasure, or just kind of the more neutral systems aim to persist in their current state, homeostasis, whatever. Those emotional and psychological responses are still responses to something that seems like it's going to harm our ability to survive or help our ability to survive and thrive. So yes, emotion, psychology, emotional meltdowns, like for example, among autistic people or neurodivergent people. There's a reason that some people will talk about the theory that what we call autism is actually a version of chronic post-traumatic stress disorder. It all gets real complicated, but we're talking about intergenerational trauma. So let me stay focused on trauma, which is just something happens and you are harmed by that physically, emotionally, psychologically. In some way, it causes you pain. And in response to that pain, you shift. Maybe your conscious mind and your physical body, maybe just your physical body, including the brain, without the consciousness. I would argue even maybe a conscious shift without a physiological one, that sometimes the way I think is a response to a prior trauma, even if my body isn't treating it as though it's fight or flight.
Right.
So something happens, it causes you pain, and then you adjust so that in an attempt to avoid that pain in the future. that thing that happens would be the traumatic incident. The adjustment that you make, the thing that you carry forward with you, that's what we call the trauma. And it is important to note that while we can talk about capital T trauma if we want, trauma is a response. Anything can trigger a trauma response, right? Like you could be in your house perfectly safe and nothing's going on, but if you think, for whatever reason, if you perceive it to be that there is a ghost haunting you that wants to kill you, then your body can still respond to that environment as though it is life or death. It can still be a traumatic incident. With auditory sensitivity, with any sensory sensitivity, sounds that other people would say, yeah, that's not a problem at all, can be traumatic for some individuals and vice versa. So when we're having this conversation for us, I am never, ever talking about capital T trauma, because I don't find that to be a very useful way to go about doing what we are doing. It serves a purpose in other contexts. If you want to do large scale studies on trauma, then yes, you need to have some way to qualify who to put in your population for the study and whatever. That's not what we're doing. We're talking about individuals. If you responded to something you had a traumatic response to something, then that thing was traumatic for you, period. Yeah. So there's that. And then intergenerational trauma, going back to where we started, means two things. One is if it changes the DNA, epigenetics, and then that change in the DNA is passed on. So some of the original stuff in both epigenetics and intergenerational trauma, these things are intertwined in the research, because some of the biggest original research that showed stuff for both of these things was done on the families, the descendants of Holocaust survivors. That Holocaust survivors, their DNA seems to have changed in some way that maps to other Holocaust survivors, and that those changes persist in the DNA that's being passed down. Mm-hmm. So that's one. The other about intergenerational trauma is that your behavior can change in response to trauma, whether it's changing the DNA or not. Your behavior changes, your emotion, the way you communicate, and that then you pass that down in just the way what we call intergenerational transmission. Mm-hmm. This means humans learn by observing and copying and responding to other humans. So a very common example of this, people will talk about all the time, at least in the United States, is people who lived through the Great Depression in the United States took on a lot of particular habits around thriftiness and saving and work ethic and whatever, that then they passed to their children, baby boomers, that they then passed to their children, and so on and so forth. Long answer. But that's what we're talking about when we mean intergenerational trauma.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this since it popped up, and I'm Irish, and it's been less than a couple of hundred years since the Great Famine in Ireland, and I wondered if it was something that was studied in the context of intergenerational trauma, because there are certain patterns of behavior. There's a persistent pattern of addictive behaviors in Irish society, but interestingly enough, it hasn't been studied on a very large scale, but you can see similar patterns reflected in other communities who have experienced similar events.
Yeah, and that's, well, so first of all, I want to say I'm not positive about this. I don't want to guarantee, but I think I just saw some study was publishing results on a study about intergenerational transmission in Irish people related to the Great Famine. But I can't say that for sure. That could just be ringing a bell about something else. Like I know, for example, very recently there was a study published about, they're doing some research in Ireland in particular about 4-day work weeks, and that just came out a couple months ago. So maybe I'm getting things confused. And yes, this is again where all this stuff gets tricky, because there are some things about being human that are more or less universal, like we have things in common in a certain way, which means that we will respond to similar stimuli in similar ways. So how do we suss out exactly, like, no, this is just how people react when they live in this kind of environment, from, no, the people who live in this environment are overwhelmingly descended from people who lived in this environment 100 years ago when this other thing happened, so maybe it's that, right? Like, we can't really suss it out, which is kind of, this is why I think it's important to be careful about trauma and intergenerational trauma. Is the way in which you think and feel and act does not require justification. You don't have to understand it or be able to explain it in order to justify it happening. It's just what happens, right?
Yeah.
But if the way in which we think or feel or act is causing problems and we want to change it and we're struggling to change it, we don't want to feel sad, but we do, or we don't want to yell at our friends, but we do sometimes, or we don't want to get panicky at the grocery store, but we do, right? That's when we start to theorize about, okay, well, why am I behaving the way that I am? Because if I come up with a theory about why I'm behaving or thinking or feeling this way, then that may mean that I can come up with a theory of something to do to change it so that I don't get panicky at the grocery store or yell at my friends, or I forgot the other example that I used. In many cases, especially in the modern world and the modern Western world especially, psychological and emotional and cognitive explanations are not considered to be valid. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't like this thing because it makes me anxious. Often we'll be like, well, why does it make you, I need a reasonable explanation. And part of the reason that trauma and intergenerational trauma in particular are so hot recently is because when people are reacting, feeling, thinking, or doing things that they don't like and they want to change, we initially tend to start with, what's wrong with me? Why am I like this? Why, I'm doing it wrong. I'm a bad person. I got to change. I got to try harder, care more, whatever. And that sometimes we do that because it works, right? Like, most of the time when we try to do that, when we just feel bad about something, most of the time we're able to do something to change it and resolve it from there. But when we can't, we get stuck in these loops of just feeling terrible about being the way that we are, reacting the way that we're reacting. And then someone comes along and offers you an explanation that, while still limited in one particular way, that it still is limited to you as an individual and not addressing the environment, it makes it biological. You're not panicky at the grocery store because you are a panicky person, or because you are ridiculous, or because you're weak. You're panicky at the grocery store because it's a trauma response. Meaning, usually when people are talking about it this way, what they mean is it's encoded into your biology. So it's not about your consciousness and what you're thinking or what you're wanting. It's just how it's happening, which is true. But it was true before that too. It was true before that explanation. Meaning, if you don't want something, then you don't want it. The fact that you do it doesn't mean that you want it. The fact that you think or feel or do something doesn't mean that that's what you want. Mm-hmm. But we have kind of created this idea that you do want it. Even if you don't consciously want it, you subconsciously want it. So now we have to have this other response to say, no, you don't want it. It's just how your biology works. That's always what it was. So it's good to be able to say that out loud. Also, though, then sometimes people will then take that to mean, well, it's biological and therefore I can't do anything about it except for maybe medical or biological interventions, which would negate the whole point of what trauma is, right? Like, if nothing can be done to adjust your biological makeup, then there wouldn't be trauma in the first place. The point of the trauma is that it adjusted your biological makeup so that your future responses were different. We can do that. We don't always know exactly what or how, or how to make it adjust it the way that we want it to be. But sometimes people will get very locked in on, because I experienced X, Y, or Z trauma, there's nothing I can do. This is just how I'm going to be. This is just how I'm going to respond. So it alleviates the distress of, why do I respond this way? But doesn't alleviate any of the distress that's caused by the response itself.
Yeah. You just left thinking, well, this is how I'm wired. So nothing I can do about that in the family. Yeah.
There's a reason that since Freud, blaming the mother in particular, but blaming the parents, that's just that we didn't call it intergenerational trauma at that point, but same deal. It's like, oh, this stuff that you're dealing with because of something your parents did or that their parents did. It's a way of absolving people of the fault or the blame for experiencing, thinking, feeling, or acting the way that they are that they don't want to be doing, which is great. I don't want people to feel blame or fault.
Right.
It just should never have been there in the first place. We shouldn't have tried to convince each other and ourselves that it is your fault unless you can blame someone else. So trauma and intergenerational trauma, well, that's a double whammy. Not only is it not my fault because it's just a trauma response of something that happened to me that wasn't, I didn't choose it, something bad happened to me and hurt me, and that's why I'm being like this. But now it's even more removed than that it's not even something that happened to me. It's something that happened to my parents, and they responded in a particular way. So they didn't choose it either, but they did pass it on to me. And that's why we are all hypochondriacs or whatever it is that you're trying to explain away. So useful language, just, don't ever argue with somebody else about whether what they've experienced is traumatic or not. Their trauma and your trauma is different. Nobody else saying X was traumatic for me invalidates whatever you experienced that was traumatic for you. And if they experienced something similar to you and it wasn't traumatic for them, that doesn't mean it shouldn't be or couldn't have been traumatic for you. Which is not how we respond.
Yeah.
Now that we've taken half an hour, like, hopefully we did what we've normally done, which is like accidentally answered some of the other questions.
Yeah, I think so. I was going to ask, what are some of the ways in which trauma responses or signs of this intergenerational trauma will manifest in people? Like, if you're looking at the behavior, what is it that you would encounter as a therapist?
So that's flipped. It's not that intergenerational trauma results in certain things that we can see and say, oh, that's a sign of intergenerational trauma. All of this trauma, intergenerational trauma, anything that we're talking about initiates in an experience that a person has, again, thinking, feeling, or doing something that they don't want to be thinking, feeling, or doing. And there's various, that goes all the way up to being so badly hurt by what they're thinking or feeling or doing that they would rather die, right? But it starts there. You notice something, and then we start exploring potential explanations for why that experience is happening. So something happens, and in our exploration of why we think that might be happening, again, only because we want to come up with a theory of what can we do differently to impact it. So if we say, you know what, this might be a result of intergenerational trauma, then that guides us in a certain direction of like, okay, these are things that people who've experienced intergenerational trauma have done and found a lot of success with. So it helps us kind of narrow in on things to try. That said, mostly when we're talking about trauma of any kind, like if whatever the initial thing is that's happening, and then we're exploring it and we're going to talk about trauma potentially, we're talking about fight or flight, some version of that. And we're talking about it being disproportionate to the cognitive understanding of what the threat is. So if someone sets a loose bear in my room and I go into fight or flight, like, we would say that's reasonable.
Yeah.
If someone asks me to read a book and I respond as though it's a bear in my room, we would say that seems disproportionate. And again, even then, like, my first thing would be, well, is it viable for me to just not have people ask me to read books before going on any other like journey of self-exploration and change? And if it's not, then I'm going to say, okay, I got to figure out how to respond differently when people ask me to read a book, because that's not working for me. So yeah, it's a fight or flight response, or we can talk about it as prefrontal cortex shutdown. It's in body keeps the score. It kind of intertwines with what we call vagal nerve theory that was also being developed, or at least popularized around the same time. You have, we'll oversimplify it. You have two different nervous systems. One is, this is not time to think, this is time to act. Thinking is not going to be helpful here. We got to move fast. We dump adrenaline into the system. Colloquially, we call that fight or flight.
Yeah.
The other is, body is calm, mind is active. We're going to think our way through this. And of course, like I said, oversimplifying. It's not just two things, but to make it simple, you switch back and forth between these things. And what we would like to do, again, generally in our modern day, what feels more comfortable to us is calm body. Let me think through this. I want a cognitive explanation, understanding, rationale, theory about what to be done. And when I respond differently than that, when it's, no, I'm just moving and I'm not thinking, sometimes we're fine. We call that zoning out or being in the zone or whatever. Like there's lots of versions of it we like. But if it's stuff we don't like, then we'll usually call it fight or flight. So typically we're looking at, you're experiencing that fight or flight, you're responding, adrenaline's dumping, your heart rate's increasing, your breathing becomes more shallow, your skin flushes, you get sweaty, all the signs of anxiety or panic, that is your body basically saying something is about to hurt us if we're not real careful or fast to respond. You're going to experience something like that and then not be able to explain why.
Yeah.
If you can explain why, whether your explanation is accurate or not, we're still probably not going to talk about or explore trauma. If you say, yes, I felt that way because it was a big presentation in front of 1,000 people and I was real nervous. Now, we could still say you respond to talking in front of 1,000 people like that because of trauma or intergenerational trauma, but generally people are not going to need to.
Yeah.
Generally people are going to say like, yeah, that makes sense. I need no further explanation. That is a scary scenario, even though it is unlikely that those 1,000 people will storm the stage and kill you or whatever, right? So again, that's not, I want to show over and over, and maybe I'm doing it too much and wasting too much time, or that like, this is all, we could describe any of it in different ways. That's what would start us looking at it. You're experiencing fight or flight in response to something in some kind of pattern, right? It doesn't feel just purely random to you. You've said like, every time X happens, I get panicky, or I get panicky and I don't get panicky every time X happens, but I do notice that these times where I'm getting panicky out of nowhere, it does seem like X is happening. We're looking at a pattern and you don't have anything from your own life to say why that would be, then we can start looking at intergenerational trauma.
Right. So if this is something you want to resolve in therapy or elsewhere, I guess a lot of people call it breaking the cycle, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't necessitate having to go back to your parents or your grandparents and going, I'm like this because of what happened to you. We all need to fix this together, right? Am I right?
No, it doesn't.
Quietly, right?
If we thought really hard, maybe we could come up with a scenario where it would be difficult to think of something to do that didn't involve going back to the previous generations, but that'd be really tough. I mean, generally speaking, you don't have to go back to previous generations and explore it with them.
Yeah.
Mostly when we're going to do this, if you are going to go back to previous generations, it's about information gathering, not resolving it. It's more like you're experiencing fight or flight in response to X and you don't know why. Well, then let's ask mom and dad about X and see if either of them have any strange experiences or thoughts about X. And if not, let's ask grandma and grandpa about X and see if they, so kind of a way to get some information that might make us say, oh yeah, this is intergenerational trauma. But again, part of the reason I'm trying to hit this so hard of what I'm saying is just because we've identified something as intergenerational trauma doesn't mean that therefore you must respond to it this way.
Yeah.
Or that if you respond to it this way, it will definitely help. Anything, your aversion to cats, we could theoretically say is intergenerational trauma. Your love of sunny days, we could theoretically. So it's just stuff that causes you a problem. And like anything else that causes you a problem, we're looking for what you can do about it.
And the reason I asked that is because I think some people feel like if they cannot resolve this with the previous generation, then it just cannot be resolved.
I'd have to know what those people were saying specifically, right? Like, because we talked a bit about this when we were talking about grief and closure and stuff earlier too, that like you can get closure by communicating with people. That's not the only way to get it.
Yeah.
And this is, again, part of why I'm hitting the vagueness of these definitions so much, is so that people don't get stuck thinking they have to do a particular thing about it.
Exactly.
Because if you think that, you might be fortunate and be able to do that thing, and it does resolve you. You might be unfortunate and you're not able to. Like, what if your parents and grandparents are dead and there's nothing you can, then you just say, I'm stuck with this and there's nothing.
Right. Yeah. So it's good to just remind people that there are ways to resolve this, even if you cannot go back and discuss it with other members of the family.
Yeah. Even thinking about it as intergenerational trauma is just something you're thinking of it as.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean it's valid. I'm not trying to take that away from somebody. It's a valid thing, but it's not the correct explanation. It's just a concept we have to explain a certain thing. Because even those changes in DNA, it's not like we can map any particular gene to any particular experience.
Right.
We have at best some correlations, and those correlations are very weak, because let's say people have condition X and we want to see if there's a genetic marker for that. Well, the first thing we do is gather up a bunch of people who have condition X and a bunch of people who don't, and look at their genes and compare. Well, but if condition X is a disorder and not a disease, like all the things we're talking about are, whether that's autism or depression or PTSD, whatever, those things are diagnosed arbitrarily. So from the beginning, the study is already flawed in that we're only looking at people who have been identified and diagnosed as having a thing, and then they become self-reinforcing. Yes, we decided these people have a thing. We looked at their genes, found these things in common, and now we say that these genes equal these things, and we can prove it because, look, people who have these genes have the thing. But that's how we started. People who have the thing had the genes. Anyway. So no, there's no one right or wrong way to address this. And with most, well, I'll stop and let you get to the next question because I don't even know what our questions all are.
Well, I guess the most obvious question leading on from that is, what are the kind of techniques or therapies that are useful in dealing with trauma, or any, as you say, any kind of behavior that we don't find ideal that we would like to change?
So we're going to talk about, whenever we're talking about what to do, we're generally going to be able to break it down into two categories. One is coping, which means once you start experiencing the thing that is happening, that has been happening, that is problematic for you in whatever way, what can you do at that point to get things to be better, to change things at that point? That's coping. The other is prevention, which prevention we can kind of break down into further categories, but basically means, how do we make it so that the experience that you've been having doesn't happen as much anymore? And so prevention is more specific to the thing that is causing the trauma response, that's triggering the trauma response. So we'll start with coping. And with coping, it is the stuff that you would be doing with any self-regulatory behaviors, like if you're having panic attacks or anxiety, or if you're depressed or having emotional spirals or shutdowns, any emotional regulation behaviors, coping skills. And that's where people usually start with trauma, is, okay, when you are feeling triggered, and in the context of trauma, what we mean is a trauma response. So a traumatic thing happened, you had the trauma response, and you carry the trauma forward with you. And now when certain things happen that have something in common with the original traumatic incident, it triggers that trauma response again. So something terrible happened to you in a room that had walls painted red, and now anytime you walk into a room with walls painted red, you have a panic attack. So that's what we mean by triggered. Something in the environment triggers that trauma response, reminds your body, maybe and your brain, or maybe in your conscious mind too, but at least your body and brain get reminded of the initial thing and are now responding as though it is that initial thing. For neurodivergent people in particular, stimming and fidgeting, anything, if you have a sensitivity to a particular type of data, engaging in some activity that gives you that kind of data in a way that doesn't matter. Like, I have a tactile sensitivity. So when I'm fidgeting, I'm going to do tactile things with little clicks and bumps and weights and senses, textures and whatever. if I was like baking or whatever, that wouldn't work as a stim or a fidget, because I would need to pay close attention to like, is this hot? How does it feel? But this, it's just repetitive. It's not important. So my brain doesn't really need to hold on to it. It does pay attention to it because I'm sensitive to that data, brings it in, and it's just like, it doesn't matter. So it kind of decreases the intensity of whatever else is happening. In like CBT style approaches, you would do responses to automatic negative thoughts, a lot of like mantras, things like, oh, I am safe, or whatever, right? Or this is not the place that I was when whatever happened, or, you know, just kind of consciously reminding yourself of these things. Meditation techniques and mindfulness techniques, really like getting yourself away from the thing that's triggering it, which is a lot easier if you can identify what thing you think it is that's triggering it. If you have no idea and it just starts happening, then trying to remove yourself from the environment completely to just, who knows what the trigger was, but get away from it all might help. Those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Meditation
is one of my go-tos, and so is this, my trusty weighted blanket. So when I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed or overstimulated, I just go sit under my weighted blanket for a while and do a 5-minute meditation, and then that kind of helps me to
nice.
Into,
yeah, I would say as a general thing that some things like mindfulness, meditation, those kinds of things, those CBT type responses are cognitive. You do them in your conscious space, not a physical like thing that actually exists. So you can kind of separate coping techniques into conscious or cognitive ones and physical ones. And if physical ones don't work for you so well, or don't work for you in a particular context so well, try something cognitive, and vice versa. In the case of trauma in particular, a lot of the time what's causing people problems is that they're relatively cognitively focused people. And so then they're feeling a physical activation, fight or flight, right? Like they feel their body shift physically, but don't have a cognitive explanation or reason. And that's part of why it causes even more. It's like, what the hell's going on with me? So in those cases, you might want to recognize that, well, your cognitive abilities aren't really tracking and dealing with whatever it is that's happening well. So try and focus on physical coping techniques. Even if traditionally mindfulness works for you very well, if it's not working with this thing, consider that this thing is not something that it has a cognitive component like that. This is just your body responding, and therefore your body needs to get different input.
Yeah. I find a combination of the two has helped me, because if I just lie under the weighted blanket with no other input, then my body starts to relax. My brain is just going overtime. But if I'm listening to it has to be a guided meditation. There has to be somebody talking to me, because I have there's a bit of distraction. Somebody else is telling me what to do next. And if the two are working in tandem, I find I relax a lot quicker.
Just a thought for you, but also for many of the people who might be listening to this. A sensitivity to social data is a construct that we've invented and talk about, but we do it because we find it useful, that other people, data coming from other people draws your attention, and there are positives and negatives to that. But this is one. If you need to like calm down or regulate, then getting data from other people, like a guided meditation, might be more impactful and draw your attention more. Because at the end of the day, what we're doing in coping with what's happening is trying to shift your resources into, oh, let's focus on responding to this other thing instead. And by the way, again, this is part of why like talking about trauma is so important and so common, is because people will say things like, you just need to get your mind off it, focus on something else. Or in neurodivergent circles, people talking about like, oh, learn to unmask. Well, sometimes, yes, we're responding to something as though it is more dangerous than it really is. And that's causing us a problem. We're in fight or flight because someone asked us to read a book. Other times, we're responding that way and it actually is dangerous. Even the example I'm using about someone asked us to read a book. Well, if I say, okay, but then I struggle reading it and now I've committed, that can trigger an emotional meltdown, right? Like now I feel trapped between, I can't do this thing, it's not making sense, but I also can't go back to them because I told them I would do it. And what? So be very, very cautious about telling anybody, including yourself, that they don't need to respond as though it is dangerous, because people will like generalize that. If we say you should unmask, then some people are going to interpret that to mean like, so I should just never filter anything I say around anyone. And no, absolutely not. Like, you learn to mask for a reason. It's not an inherent part of being whatever kind of a person you are. It's something that you've learned to do because the responses you were giving initially without going through that process of filtering or masking were causing problems for you. And it's going to still happen. It's about being able to identify when you're safe first, and then adjust and relax, try to make yourself relax if you identify that you are safe or safer than you're responding as though it's the case. So anyway, yeah, other people, and just generally get your mind onto other things, get your body focused on other things. Whatever particular thing we're going to talk about that might work for anybody, it is some version of shift your mind to thinking about this, or shift your body to focusing on this sensation or this context or whatever. Because I think this is important. There is no way, literally, we do not have a mechanism that allows us to decrease the amount of attention we are paying to something. That's not a thing we can do. If you attempt to consciously think less about something, that thought about how you should think less of the thing is in itself a thought about the thing. It is impossible. The only thing we can do is make ourselves think about or pay attention to something more than we currently are. And so what we do, because these resources are finite, if we make ourselves pay attention to something else, the amount of attention we have available for that initial thing decreases. Mm-hmm. And I'm saying this because a thing I see all the time is people who have success with things that help them calm down, right? I'm freaking out, and then I do this thing and I become content and calm. And then they will call that thing a distraction or an escape and invalidate it. Yeah. And say, I shouldn't do this thing. Now, again, there's reason for that. If the same thing keeps happening and triggering a traumatic response in you, every time you quote unquote distract yourself or use an escape, you calm down. That works. That's what you're trying to do. Great. But if that thing that caused that response is going to pop up again and again and again and again, yeah, you can still use the quote unquote distraction or escape to calm down every time. But at a certain point, it becomes like, well, maybe it would be more efficient for me to figure out what the hell's going on here, mm-hmm. so that I don't have to keep doing that. But unless that's the case, unless it's that you're responding in some way to something that you're going to have to deal with again and again and again, then anything that calms you down, that solved the problem. The problem was your response to the thing being heightened, being in fight or flight. If you get yourself out of that, problem solved. That's not a bad thing. I don't care if it's video games. I don't care if it's YouTube videos. I don't care if it's whatever. As long as the thing that you're doing doesn't in and of itself cause problems, yeah, then it's a great thing for you to do. The worst case scenario, as long as it doesn't, like if you're shooting up heroin, it still resolves the initial problem of getting you calmed down or whatever, but it causes its own problems. So as long as the thing you're doing doesn't cause its own problems, then the worst case scenario is that you then will have to deal with whatever the thing is again later.
Mm-hmm. So that's coping.
Yeah.
What's the next step?
So prevention, here we can break it down a lot of different ways too. What most people are going for generally is what I would call automatic prevention, meaning make it so that the thing can't happen, right? Like if I have a traumatic response to people cutting me off in traffic, well, if I never get in a car, that can never happen. So that's an automatic prevention. It will never happen. Mostly with trauma, what people are generally talking about and wanting to accomplish, and to what degree it is possible is debatable, is that they want to switch it so that no matter if the trigger happens, my response to the trigger is that I will not have that same experience. Yeah. And the reason I say is because right, the red room example. Could we make it so that I don't respond to red rooms that same way? Yeah, maybe. But what about red rooms that also have pictures of clowns in them? Because they're, now there's two variables. Like, it's impossible to extricate all the variables that our bodies paid attention to and encoded as threats, and those things are going to pop up in concert. So I don't know that there's a way to make it automatic. Mm-hmm. But yeah, there is a way to work on shifting your response to those things. And that can be a lot of different stuff, like exposure therapy is one that we typically use with what we call phobias, but phobias are also something we could generally say is a traumatic response.
Right.
Or those CBT and DBT type interventions where it's very cognitively focused of basically arguing against yourself. I'm acting like this thing is a threat, but this thing is not a threat. Some version of that over and over and over, hopefully theoretically will decrease your response to that thing in such a way. But also planning for the thing you fear, right? Like if you're having a trauma response to something, it's because, like the trampoline example at the beginning, is because something happened. If we're saying it's a trauma response, it means something happened, or intergenerational trauma, something happened to one of your ancestors that went in a bad way. So if we can engage with the thing in such a way that we're preventing the possibility, or at least severely diminishing the possibility it goes that bad way. So if I jump in a trampoline, but I put nets around the trampoline so that I can't fall off, that might enable me to do the thing I need to do. In this case, I need to jump on a trampoline without having that same response. Or in cases like panic attacks, because panic disorder is often, I think it's very helpful to think of it as a traumatic response, meaning you had a panic attack, which was a traumatic experience in and of itself. Not the thing that caused the panic. The fact that you were in a panic attack in some public place without support is terrifying and traumatic. Well, now, anytime you go to a public place, especially if it's the same kind of places that happen, now you're starting to get panicky about what if I have a panic attack? Yeah. So you plan things for that worst case scenario. Well, I'm going to bring somebody with me so that if it happens, they know to do this and that with me. If you've had panic attacks at work and you can talk to a coworker that you trust, a friend, to help you with things. One that I like to recommend a lot is starting to practice noting the thing coming on. So if you say, and I always do the reverse of what people would expect. Instead of saying that 10 is the fully highly escalated trauma response, fight or flight, and 0 is baseline, it's flipped. 10 is contentment and calm. 0 is panic attack, fight or flight, whatever. What I can start to do is start to track, when I notice X, that seems to usually mean that I'm getting lower and lower, closer to that 0. So like, when I catch myself pacing, that usually means I'm at like an 8. It's not real bad, but it's not like calm and content. When I'm grinding my teeth, that usually happens at like a 5. So I'll have people create these spreadsheets where you put 10 to 0. And then first column is, what do you notice in yourself? I notice when I start to get escalated that I do X, Y, or Z. So, and then you slot that in, matching it against whatever number you think it is. Second column is you talk to the people around you that you trust and ask them what they've noticed, because they will likely have noticed things that you haven't. You start to get real like snippy when you're getting stressed out. Oh, okay, where would I put that? What do you mean by snippy? And you can do the same thing. And then the third column is, what can I do? If I notice that I'm pacing and that means I'm at an 8, well then what have I learned that I can do to kind of stop myself from going lower and maybe even reverse and get back higher if I take a break and eat something or whatever? Because different responses will be useful at different points. Like the things that might be helpful to me if I catch it at an 8 might not be helpful to me if I catch it at a 2. Or might theoretically be helpful, but by the time I'm at a 2, I'm not going to be capable of doing that thing. And vice versa, some things that are going to help me when I'm at a 2 are way more drastic than I would want to do or need to do when I'm at an 8. So we just start to train ourselves to notice the thing coming on, get an assessment of how close or far away are we from it, and therefore what do I do at this point specifically. Mm-hmm. So different ways to prevent. Automate it by just removing the possibility of having the stimuli. try to automate it by changing your response to the stimuli over time, or shift it so that you're vigilant for the thing coming on rather than vigilant once it happens, and can try and address it when it's at an easier, more addressable state.
Right. I guess, well, we're out of time, but I guess there are other questions we could ask about what if the source of the trauma response is a relationship or a domestic situation, and you're not in a position to remove yourself from it immediately.
Yeah, whether it's a relationship or a domestic situation or whatever, if there's something you can't remove yourself from, then that constrains your options. Preventing it from ever happening because you're never exposed to the trigger is not an option now. So you can still look within those constraints. There might be things you can do to make it so that the trigger happens less frequently, or you can look at things that you can do so that you respond to the trigger differently. In some relationships, at least, because just to be clear, you can have traumatic experiences in a relationship or traumatic responses to someone in a relationship without that person having done anything wrong or doing anything wrong. Sometimes, intense jealousy can be a trauma response to having been cheated on by a prior partner, even though this partner is not doing anything wrong. Mm-hmm. So we want to be careful, because again, sometimes there becomes that if someone's triggering a trauma response in you, that they're abusive. Yeah. It's not always the case. And it often is the case. I'm not saying it's, just assess for safety. It's not always safe. It's not never safe. It depends on your particular circumstances. And because if you assess for that, the things you can do are different. If I'm in a good relationship with someone who cares about me and I can communicate with, well, that unlocks a bunch of possibilities that involve us talking to each other and me making requests about them doing something differently because they might be willing to do that. Whereas somebody else, I wouldn't want to talk to them about that because then they might deliberately do that and use it against me. So if it's in a relationship or a domestic situation and it's something that you trust that the other person is not doing intentionally or unaware, or a very common pattern is that they do something that triggers a trauma response in you, they notice it and they feel so bad because let's flip it. You do something that triggers a trauma response in them, and you didn't mean to, and now they're accusing you of traumatizing them, and now you feel terrible. And one very common response to that feeling terrible is to say, no, you're being ridiculous, I didn't do anything wrong, instead of being able to say, like, okay, to be clear, that's not what I was trying to do. And Zoe, good job, Zoe. I gotta get going. And still address it for what it is. I know that this happened. You're not responding wrong. Also, that's not what I was intending. So let's do what we can do to kind of de-escalate it here. Yeah, I got the phone. Thank you, Zoe.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Zoe. Let's wrap up. It's been a really good conversation. Thank you. And we will re-upload this to YouTube on Wednesday, so we'll be able to catch up if you've missed any of it today. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Marie. Thank you.
Catch you next week.
I'll talk to you next week. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.